Hey guys, SimCoder here, and today we are going to continue with our login system. We are going to code the verify token endpoint, which will allow us to verify if the user is really the user. We are going to also connect the user to the backend, because remember, we are just using Firebase for the login. We are not saving the user's information within Firebase. So we must create an instance in our backend, in our database, better yet, which will be accessed through our backend, and that way we'll have all of the information in our side, and it won't be on Firebase's side. This is something pretty straightforward to do. We just use Firebase because it is easier to control, and we leave all of the token validation and all of that to Firebase and just handle the user information on our side. This just eases the programming logic and the programming process, so makes everything really straightforward. So let's go, let's do it. So first things first, make sure that your Docker is running. Mine already is. If you don't remember, you just have to go into our terminal and say sudo docker compose up build, and that will make sure that the Docker is running. Okay, so now jumping into our Visual Studio, this is where we left off. We had the home, the nav bar, and the login page working. Today, we are going to primarily work on the app.js because we are going to implement an off-state changed listener. This will listen for changes in the off state, and if there are any changes, then update the project, because if there are any changes, this means that the user logged in or logged out, and because of that, the page has to change necessarily. So this is really easy to do. We are going to make use of a component did mount. This is a React function which will be called anytime the component mounts, or anytime you can think of, like anytime the component loads, this function will be called upon. So let's say firebase.auth.onAuth state changed. Let's make this a tiny bit bigger and close that up. Okay. User, and now open up an arrow function. There we go. Now, this user will contain all of the information of the current logged in user, but if the user logs out and this function is called, then the user will be null. So we can say if not user, which means that the user is not logged in. Then we can say this.setState, open parentheses, and then loaded, and we are going to set this to true. This because Firebase on-off state change is called anytime you start it, so the first time that component it mounts, Firebase on-off state change will always be called upon, and then it will just be called upon whenever the off state changes. So we are going to use this in order to check if the page has loaded, and only show the page if we have the user information and we are sure that the user is logged in or logged out, because this takes a second, and Firebase on Auth takes a second to check if the user is really logged in. I believe they make some token validation, so that's why there is some delay there. And we are going to use this state variable loaded in order to choose if we are going to show the page or not, depending on if we already know if the user is logged in or not. So we'll need a constructor for this. Obviously, we need to start up the state variables, props, and again, just like we did in the previous lesson, super props. Then we simply say this.state equals to open curly brackets and loaded set to false, because remember, when you first load the page, we don't know what's the state of the user currently. So by setting the loader to true, we'll force a re-render of the page, and that way we can update everything with the most accurate description of the user. Okay, and else we are also going to say this.state loaded equals to true. Now we are going to do something in here to do further ahead. We are going to do something in here because we have to find a way of validating the user always, and to create a user if the user doesn't exist. And this is where we are going to make a call for the backend in order to do that. But for now, I'm just going to leave it to do. This line will be removed, obviously, but this is just to show you what we'll do next and why there is an else in here. Okay? So now going to the render part, we'll say if loaded this.state, this.state dot loaded, then we'll return what we had before, which is this part, obviously. But if the user hasn't, if the page hasn't loaded and we don't have the Firebase state of state, you'll simply return, I don't know, something like open an empty tag or a div, whatever. And obviously the / is before, and then say loading, something like that. Doesn't need to be pretty at this state, so I'm not going to worry about this. And going to our page, there's an error, Firebase is not defined. Again, we must import Firebase. So go up top and say import Firebase from Firebase. Coming in here, and we are going to, you can see when I reload the page, there's a second where loading shows. And that's because the Firebase of state only gets called after that. I'm going to loading, I'm logged in, so I'm going to log out, log in, test@gmail.com, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, log in, and the page goes back to normal. And if I went to log in, let me just check. Okay, it is correct. Because right now, before, if you went directly to the page login, then it would go to login. But now, because we are using this piece of code, even though we are going straight to login, it won't load because it has to wait for the on-off state change. So that this way you can make sure that the user doesn't go to the login page, whereas before it was possible to go to the login page. Okay, so as far as this part is concerned, we are done. Basically, we just have to make a call in here, as I've said. But for now, for the time being, we are going to go into the backend. And now we are going to create a user model. The model in Node, and in this case for Mongo, is just basically a schema for the user. So think of it like just setting the default values for the user and saying what kind of variables the user will have and what names those variables the user will have. In the case of the user, obviously, if you had other models like posts, for example, it would have variables related to posts. So it is just the schema for the object that we are working on at the moment. So we can come in here. Let me just check one thing. Okay. User.js. And this, again, will be our user model. So in order to create a user model, it is really simple. All we have to do is say, first of all, const mongoose, which is a library that you are using in order to use MongoDB, and say mongoose Now we can go ahead and create our user schema, which will again contain all of the information that we want the user to have. And we say new mongoose.schema, open parentheses, open curly brackets. And now we are able to input all of the data that we want the user to have. The first thing that we want the user to have is the Firebase ID. So let's come in here, Firebase ID, and now we can throw in a bunch of parameters to each and every single variable. And in this case, we want the user to be of the Firebase ID to be of the type string. So we can simply say type string, and we can say that required is true, because we want this to be a thing that has to be there in order for the user to be created. If we don't pass a Firebase ID, then it won't be allowed to be created. Required equals true, and unique true as well. Okay. Then we want a name. I'm going to keep this pretty simple so that we don't have to worry about stuff like this, because after you create the first variable, you can just simply add more to it. And we can set the default, for example, and I'm going to leave this empty, but you could give any default value that you want. And that's it. For the time being, I'm just going to leave with Firebase ID and name. There is another parameter that the user schema will have, which we don't see, which is the ID. The ID is generated automatically by Mongoose, so you don't need to worry about that. Then finally, we just need to export it. So exports mongoose.model user schema. This will just allow us to use this schema elsewhere within our project. Okay, so now I'm going to create another folder, and this will be called functions. And in the functions, I like to divide into small files the functions that we are doing. So in this case, we are going to write functions only related to the user. So I create user.js and work from there. Okay, that's the way that I like to do things. So the first thing that we want is the user schema. We are going to import it. User equals to require and in order to reach the user model, we have to go one back, so 2 points, then models, then user. Okay. Now we'll need to import Firebase admin. Firebase admin will allow us to make the validation for the user token. This is a package, and it is, or it should be, already installed within your Docker. Firebase admin like this. Okay. And now we'll need to initialize the Firebase admin, and this is pretty straightforward. Remember, you should have the config file in here. If you watched the first lesson, you have to, because I go over how to set up Firebase and all of that. So I'm going to use the variables that are inside config.js in order to accomplish the following steps. So we'll need 2 variables in order to initialize the app. First, we'll need the service account, which is require, and we have to go to the config folder. So we have to go 2 folders back, config, and then we say .service account, because remember, it is a variable. Then we have to do the same thing, but instead of service account, it is database URL. And the URL is capitalized, .url. There we go. Now we are able to start coding this part. So in order to write a function, there are multiple ways of doing files like this. The way I prefer to do it is module.export equals to open curly brackets, and then inside of this all of our functions will be written. So again, the first thing that we want to do is to verify an account. So I'm going to create a function called verify account, and this function will take on user and the ID token. So the user will be the user information like user ID and username, whatever, all of that. And the ID token will be the token, the session token that the user is currently using. So let's do this. Then we do the arrow function and we return a promise. If you don't know what promises are, then I strongly recommend you to check online what they do, because they are really amazing. But just to recap what they do, they basically promise that you'll return something within the future. They allow you to write asynchronous functions pretty easily, and anytime you want to end a function which will make a call to something else, which you don't know when the return for that call will return, you just say, whenever it returns, I'm going to promise you something. Or better yet, I'm going to make this call, but I'm going to promise you something right now. And that promise is that I'll return to you within the future. You don't know when, but you will. So you make a call to the Firebase service, for example, and when you receive it, you retrieve the promise. That's how it works. Obviously, I went really away from the core, the essence of the promise logic, but you get the point. It's just a promise that you'll give something or return something to the verify account function. So now that we have our verify account, we'll say if user equals to undefined, then we'll reject this promise. So return rejects new error, and we say auth denied. So reject just is basically our failsafe. If something goes wrong, then we just say reject. If something goes right, then we'll return the promise with resolve. But for now, we are just making sure that the user is in fact defined and everything is correct. So if the user isn't defined, then we say auth denied. Okay, so now we'll simply say firebase.auth.verify, not verify account, but verify ID token. And we'll pass along the ID token that we got from here. Okay, so we can say then decoded token. This is what it gives out, but I don't even believe we'll use it, so I'm going to probably remove it. Then we'll just go to the user, and this is the user model, and we'll try to see if a user exists with these parameters. So we are able to, in Mongo, if you want, or Mongoose in this case, if you want to find an object, you just say find one, and you'll find one by saying that the Firebase ID is equal to the user dot UID, because I'll show you what this user contains after, but I'm going to make a console log in here for the user. Okay, so we'll just try to find a user that has the Firebase ID equals to the Firebase UID, the user UID, because this will be the user retrieved to us by the Firebase backend. So we'll say then and it is going to retrieve a user, hopefully. Or better yet, if it returns a user, then it means that the user already exists. And if the user exists, then we'll just resolve user. If it doesn't, then we'll create a new user. If not user, which means that the user doesn't exist, then we'll create a new user. So new user, open bracket, parenthesis, open curly brackets, and we'll say Firebase ID dot, 2 points, user dot UID. And for the name, we don't have a name here, but we'll have an email. So I'm going to set the name to the email, user dot email. And if the user wants to change this, then the user can afterwards. Okay, and then in order to save this object to our database, it is as easy as saying save. Really, that's just it. And we are able to say then user arrow function, and we can say resolve user. Okay. Obviously, it is always a good thing to implement the catch function, just to make sure that nothing goes horribly wrong. So catch arrow function. And in case of an error, remember we do reject. So new error, and you'll say something went wrong. You can place whatever you want in here. You can even pass along the error, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to pass along the error because this doesn't compromise our database in any meaningful way, I believe. So yeah, I'm going to leave it as that. Now, if the user does exist, then we can simply resolve with user. That way, the front end or whatever made the call will receive the user. Okay, and we have it then. So I'm going to also add a catch for the verify ID token in case something goes wrong. And there we go. We have our verify function working, hopefully. And I just noticed that I missed one thing. I started writing this part, but I didn't finish it. So I'm going to initialize the Firebase admin really quickly. All you have to do is Firebase admin dot initialize app, open parentheses, open curly brackets, and say credential, and say Firebase admin dot credential dot cert, and the cert will take on the service accounts, then say comma and database URL. Yeah, I started writing what the initialize app needed, but didn't finish it. Don't know why. So yeah, now what's left to do is to write the endpoint. The endpoint is basically the routes through which the user makes the call, the HTTP request. So it is just an URL which will take on. This part is in the routes.js, and in here we are able to write our endpoint and decide what it will be. So, and then make the calls for the function and return the data needed to the front end. So I'm going to double up on this route that we have in here, and we'll say API user verify user. Yeah. So in order for the user to verify, it will need to call upon this function in order to do that. So this part will receive two variables, two parameters, better yet, which will be the ID not, the user, and the ID token. And we'll say that this is equal to rec.query. And this way we'll be able to retrieve the data that came from the request. Then in order to make the call to the function, to the verify account function, we first need to have the user func defined in here. So user func, or better yet, user func equals to require. And now again, we have to see where the user is. So it is in the same folder, but we'll have to go into functions and then user. Okay. User func will then call upon the verify accounts, which will take on the user and the ID token. And we'll say, then results, open arrow function, and we'll say res.json, open parentheses, results. And again, we should have a catch always. So catch, error, and res.json, error. These res could have multiple things. I'm not sure about the structure, but I believe you can have it structured like this. This will be the error code, for example, and this will be the error. But for now, I'm going to keep it simple and just retrieve the error. And that's it. So now all that we have to do is to go into the app.js and make the Axios call. Okay, so now that we have our endpoint ready, our verify account endpoints ready, we are able to make the call within our front end in order to validate the account that is currently logged in, and this will be done in this else. Now, we could do this in another way. We could just verify the account whenever a request is made, but because we are developing here the application, we are not able to use Firebase functions, for example, in order to, when an account is created, we make a request to our backend through Firebase, and then an account is created then. But the problem is, because we are using a local host, we are running our server in our PCs, we are not able to do this because we don't have a domain and Firebase couldn't point to anywhere else. So the better way of doing this, I found, was just in the auth state listener doing the call, the HTTP request to our backend, and that way you could create an account if it doesn't exist like we saw previously. So the better way of doing this is to just come into the else. I'm going to remove the to-do. And doing Firebase, and now we are going to learn how to create a token. This will be really helpful in the future, so pay close attention. Firebase auth dot current user dot get ID token and parentheses true. This true just says that it will force this function to create a new token. So if you set it to false, it will try to reuse a token that was previously created. Say then ID token, arrow function, and in here we are going to make our first Axios call. So Axios is just a way of making HTTP requests. It is a package. There are many out there, but I find that Axios is the one that works better for me. So that's the one that I'm going to use. It is already installed, so all you have to do is say import Axios from Axios. And now, in order to make an HTTP request, which we'll make 10 of them during this series, all you have to do is say Axios.post, because this will be a post call, and then inside it just place the the link for the endpoint. So HTTP //127 0.0.0.1, better yet, 2.6200, which is the port of our backend, slash API slash, and let me now check, what did we call it? Slash API slash user slash verify. So let's do it like that. Yep. And then it asks for a couple of parameters. The second parameter is null, and the third parameter is our params. So for the params, I'm going to show you in a second. Let me just open up the brackets. For the params, we take in the user and the ID token. They must be called exactly like we have in here, because otherwise these variables won't get populated with the rect query. And I just found a mistake. In here it is post and not get. So make sure you change that. So within the params, we must pass along the firebase.auth.current user, and we must pass along the ID token, obviously. So that's it. Now we can simply leave it at that. We don't need a then, because it will verify in the backend and we don't need to handle anything, but I'm going to actually create a then just so that you can see how everything returns. So results, console log, results. Okay, so right now I'm going just to give it a quick test, and then I'll be back to show you if there are any mistakes and to fix them if there are. Okay, so I made a couple of mistakes, and they are really easy to fix, so don't worry. The first of all, in the users functions, because all of them were in here, in the Firebase admin I forgot to add require. Then the user that comes in here is a string, and we have to parse it into a JSON, otherwise it won't work. And we can do this by simply coming in here and saying let user JSON. This could be a const as well, but yeah, let's change it into a const. So const user JSON equals to JSON.parse user. This way we'll get a JSON, an object which we can actually use. Otherwise, this would give out a null. So in order to change that, you just change user by user JSON. So in the Firebase ID, change user by user JSON, and in here also user for user JSON. And that's mostly it, because it was giving out this error for the require, and if you try to make a call, even if you fix that, it would give out an error. But for now, I believe that's all. Let's go into our website, reload, and it is the user is logged in, so let's log out. Going to log in, test@gmail.com, 1 2 3 4 5 6, log in, and the request was successful, and we can see all of the data, because remember, this request is giving out, is resolving the user, and this is going to be the response of our HTTP request. And we get the Firebase ID and the name, which is test@gmail.com. So the user was created successfully. And as you can see, we have the ID which was created by Mongoose. And if you go into our, open up the terminal, we can see the console log, which contains all of the data of the user. Remember, we have the console log in here. So this is what our Firebase Auth current user in the front end is. And you can see there is a bunch of information in here. The most important one is the provided data, which is the data that Firebase has. So the user now exists both in Firebase and in our server. So that's it. Everything is working fine. When we log out, we are able to log in again, and all of that good stuff. So yeah. For the login part is done. We don't need to do anything else, I believe. Now it's just about coding YouTube and doing all of that. So adding videos, creating videos, viewing videos, subscribing and whatnot. And we are going to handle all of that in the lessons to come. So yeah, thank you all very much for watching. I hope to see you again tomorrow, and ciao.